October 25th, 1944. Dawn broke over the Philippine Sea with a blood-red sky that sailors would later swear was an omen. Commander Ernest Evans stood on the bridge of the USS Johnston, watching the horizon through salt-crusted binoculars, when the impossible materialized before his eyes. 4 massive Japanese battleships, their towering superstructures cutting through the morning mist like steel mountains, emerged alongside 6 heavy cruisers and 11 destroyers. The most powerful surface fleet Japan had assembled in months was bearing down on Taffy 3, a small collection of 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts that suddenly found themselves the only barrier between Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force and the virtually defenseless American landing forces at Leyte Gulf. The Japanese officers aboard the battleship Yamato permitted themselves smiles of satisfaction. Through their powerful optics, they surveyed what appeared to be prey, cornered and helpless. The American escort carriers, affectionately called jeep carriers by their crews, were slow, lightly armored vessels designed to provide air support for amphibious operations, not to engage in surface combat with the most powerful warships afloat. The destroyers protecting them were even more laughable. Thin-skinned vessels the Imperial Navy dismissively referred to as tin cans, so lightly armored that a single hit from an 18-inch shell could tear them in half. The Japanese had every tactical advantage: bigger guns that could fire farther, thicker armor that could withstand punishment, and overwhelming numbers. Admiral Kurita ordered his fleet to increase speed, anticipating what would be remembered as a turkey shoot. Aboard the escort carrier USS Fanshawe Bay, Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague received the spotter reports with a sinking feeling in his gut. His voice crackled across the radio frequencies, ordering his carriers to turn east and launch every aircraft they could get airborne. But he knew the mathematics of the situation. His ships could make 17 knots at best. The Japanese battleships could chase them down at 30. His 5-inch guns had a maximum range of 10 miles. The Japanese battleships could open fire from 25 miles away. According to every naval warfare manual ever written, Taffy 3 was already dead. They simply hadn't stopped moving yet. The escort carriers began generating smoke, a desperate attempt to hide in a fog of their own making, while their crews worked frantically to arm and launch aircraft with whatever ordnance was available, even anti-submarine depth charges that would be nearly useless against armored warships. Commander Evans made a decision that would echo through naval history. Rather than waiting for orders, rather than accepting the role of sacrificial lamb, he turned the Johnston toward the enemy fleet and ordered flank speed. His executive officers stared at him in disbelief. They were charging directly at battleships whose main guns fired shells weighing as much as a small car. Evans, a Cherokee descendant from Oklahoma, who had told his crew on commissioning day that they would never retreat and would always fight with everything they had, pressed the intercom button that connected him to every station on his ship. His words were simple, delivered in a voice that betrayed no fear. A large Japanese fleet has been contacted. They are 15 miles away and headed in our direction. They are believed to have 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, and a number of destroyers. This will be a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival cannot be expected. We will do what damage we can. The crew of the Johnston, 327 men who had every reason to turn and run, instead loaded their guns and prepared to charge headlong into history. The Johnston's engines screamed as Chief Engineer Lieutenant Joseph Worthington pushed them beyond their designed limits, black smoke pouring from the stacks as the destroyer accelerated to 35 knots. Evans stood rock-steady on the bridge, plotting an attack approach that violated every principle of naval tactics. Standard doctrine called for destroyers to lay smoke, harass from maximum range, and survive to fight another day. Evans had different plans. He ordered his helmsman to steer directly for the heavy cruiser column, closing the distance at a rate that left his officers breathless. The Japanese, accustomed to cautious American tactics, initially interpreted the charging destroyer as a desperate attempt to flee in the wrong direction, until the Johnston opened fire at 21,000 yards, her 5-inch guns barking defiance at ships 10 times her size. According to contemporary accounts preserved in the Naval Historical Center archives, the first salvo from the Johnston struck the heavy cruiser Kumano, followed rapidly by more than 200 rounds fired in rapid succession as the American destroyer closed to point-blank range by battleship standards. The Japanese fleet, which had been steaming in organized columns with the confidence of hunters approaching cornered prey, suddenly found themselves dodging and weaving to avoid this lone destroyer that seemed possessed by a death wish. The Kumano took multiple hits to her superstructure, fires breaking out along her deck. More critically, the Johnston's torpedo officer, Lieutenant Edward DeGardy, waited with ice in his veins until the range closed to 9,000 yards before launching a full spread of 10 Mark 15 torpedoes. The crew held its breath, counting seconds as the weapons ran true through the water. One struck the Kumano directly, blowing off her bow and flooding her forward compartments, taking the heavy cruiser out of the battle and forcing her to retire. A single destroyer, built for $70 million and displacing 1,400 tons, had just crippled a warship worth 5 times as much and displacing 13,000 tons. The Japanese response was immediate and overwhelming. The battleship Congo opened fire with her 14-inch main battery, massive shells creating waterspouts 200 feet high that drenched the Johnston's deck with seawater. A cruiser salvo found its mark, 3 shells smashing into the Johnston's bridge and engine room. Commander Evans was thrown across the bridge by the concussion, 2 fingers of his left hand torn away by shrapnel, burns covering his face and neck. The ship's steering control was severed, forcing the crew to steer manually from the aft steering compartment. One engine went offline, reducing speed. Electrical power flickered throughout the vessel. Any reasonable commander would have withdrawn to attempt repairs, would have counted himself lucky to have survived this long against impossible odds. Evans wiped blood from his eyes, refused morphine for his wounds, and ordered the Johnston to rejoin the fight. Through the smoke and chaos, he could see that his suicidal charge had accomplished something unexpected. It had bought time. The other destroyers of Taffy 3, inspired or shamed by the Johnston's example, were now charging forward as well. The USS Hull, under Commander Leon Kintberger, was making her own torpedo run against the battleship line. The USS Heermann, commanded by Commander Amos Hathaway, was weaving through the Japanese formation, firing at point-blank range. The destroyer escorts Samuel B. Roberts, Dennis, John C. Butler, and Raymond were adding their smaller guns to the chaos. What should have been a one-sided slaughter had transformed into a swirling melee where Japanese gunners found themselves shooting at targets that appeared from smoke banks at suicidally close range, fired their weapons with reckless abandon, and then disappeared back into the smoke before the slower traversing battleship guns could track them. Admiral Kurita, standing on the Yamato's flag bridge, felt the situation slipping from his control. His carefully organized fleet was now scattered across miles of ocean, individual ships taking evasive action against torpedo spreads, captains making independent decisions to avoid collisions or pursue attackers. The battle plan had called for a disciplined advance in formation. Instead, his fleet was fragmented and reactive. Radio reports flooded in. The Kumano was retiring. The Suzuya was hit and slowing. The Chikuma was under attack. Through his binoculars, he could see the American escort carrier still steaming away, still launching aircraft, still surviving when by all rights they should have been obliterated in the first 15 minutes. The tin cans were supposed to be easy prey, vessels to be brushed aside en route to the real targets. Instead, they were fighting like cornered wolves, and every minute they delayed him was another minute for American reinforcements to arrive. The Johnston's crew fought their dying ship with a ferocity that bordered on madness. With main power fluctuating, gun crews hand-cranked their turrets into position. With fire control computers offline, Lieutenant Robert Hagen called range estimates from twisted wreckage, calculating firing solutions in his head while standing in ankle-deep water from ruptured pipes. Damage control parties sealed breaches with mattresses and wooden planks when steel patches ran out. In the forward ammunition magazine, gunner's mate second-class Paul Henry and his crew passed shells hand-to-hand in the darkness, the air so thick with cordite smoke that men tied wet rags across their faces to breathe. The ship shuddered with each salvo fired, with each hit received, metal screaming as bulkheads warped and frames twisted, yet somehow she stayed afloat and continued fighting. The Hull was not so fortunate. Commander Kintberger's destroyer had closed to within 9,000 yards of the battleship line, launched her torpedoes, and scored at least one hit on the massive Yamato, forcing even the world's largest battleship to turn away and lose precious time. But the cost was devastating. 40 hits from Japanese shells, ranging from 5-inch to 14-inch caliber, transformed the whole into a floating wreck. Her engine rooms flooded. Fires consumed her superstructure. Dead and wounded littered her decks. At 8:55 in the morning, with water lapping at her main deck and no hope of survival, Kintberger gave the order to abandon ship. The crew leaped into water fouled with oil and debris as the hull rolled over and sank, taking with her more than half her crew, 253 men who would never see home again. Japanese destroyers raced past the survivors without stopping to take prisoners, still focused on reaching the escort carriers beyond. The Samuel B. Roberts, a destroyer escort even smaller and more lightly armed than the destroyers, earned a reputation that morning that would forever change how destroyer escorts were viewed by the Navy. Commander Robert Copeland drove his ship directly into the heavy cruiser column, his 300-ton vessel engaging 13,000-ton warships in a gun duel at point-blank range. Historical records from the engagement, preserved in Samuel Morrison's official naval history, document that the Roberts fired so rapidly and accurately that Japanese officers later reported they believed they were under attack by a light cruiser. Her crew fired 650 rounds in less than an hour, so many that the gun barrels were white-hot and beginning to warp. They landed hits on the Chikuma that started fires the cruiser would never fully control. But Japanese shells found their mark as well. Catastrophic hits that flooded the engine room, ignited ammunition, and tore open the destroyer escort's thin hull like tissue paper. At 9 o'clock, Copeland ordered abandon ship, and 10 minutes later, the Samuel B. Roberts slipped beneath the waves, taking 90 men with her into the depths. Aboard the Johnston, Commander Evans maintained his position at the forward steering station despite wounds that would have incapacitated most men. His ship had become a magnet for Japanese fire, a crippled destroyer still refusing to sink, still firing her remaining operational gun, still attempting to position herself between the enemy and the escort carriers. 3 Japanese battleships and multiple cruisers concentrated their fire on this impudent tin can that simply would not die. Shells bracketed the Johnston, walking up and down her length. A hit in the forward gun mount killed the entire crew instantly. Another penetrated the deck and exploded in crew berthing, creating carnage below decks. The aft ammunition magazine flooded to prevent explosion, leaving only a handful of shells remaining for the working guns. The ship listed heavily to port, her speed reduced to a crawl, oil slicks marking her passage across the water. Lieutenant Ernest Samuel, the Johnston's gunnery officer, found Commander Evans in the smoke and chaos, urging him to give the order to abandon ship. Evans, his face blackened by burns and blood, his uniform in tatters, looked at the Japanese fleet that was finally beginning to achieve its formation and advance past Taffy 3's position. Through the smoke, American escort carriers were still visible, still escaping, still surviving. Evans shook his head. His ship still had one gun firing, still had forward momentum, still had value as a target drawing fire away from more important vessels. He ordered the colors struck, not in surrender, but because the mast was about to collapse, and then raised on a makeshift flagpole a shredded American flag that had already been torn by shrapnel multiple times that morning. The Johnston would fight until the sea itself took her, not 1 second before. Around him his crew understood and returned to their stations without a word, accepting that they were dead men still fighting. Their tombstone a patch of Pacific Ocean that would forever remember the morning tin cans refused to run. The morning of October 25th had transformed the Philippine Sea into a hellscape of smoke, flame, and steel. Aircraft from the escort carriers, Wildcats, Avengers, and FM fighters hastily armed with whatever ordnance deck crews could load, swarmed over the Japanese fleet like angry hornets. Pilots made strafing runs with empty guns after expending their ammunition, attempting to distract gunners and disrupt fire control. Some dropped depth charges on battleships, weapons designed for submarines but used in desperation against surface targets with minimal effect. Lieutenant Commander Edward Huxtable circled his Avenger above the carnage, radioing target coordinates to any American ship or aircraft that could hear, watching the dance of destroyers below with a mixture of awe and horror that he would struggle to describe in his after-action report filed days later. Admiral Kurita faced a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. His fleet had superior firepower, superior armor, superior range, every material advantage except time. The American destroyers and destroyer escorts had accomplished something impossible. They had held his center force at bay for more than 2 hours through sheer audacity and sacrifice. Those 2 hours had allowed the escort carriers to open the distance, had allowed aircraft to be launched and rearmed, had allowed distress calls to bring reinforcements racing toward the battle. More critically, the disorder of the engagement had scattered his fleet. The Kumano was retiring with her bow destroyed. The Suzuya was hit and leaking oil. The Chikuma was slowing from accumulated damage. His destroyer screen was fragmented, pursuing individual targets rather than maintaining formation. And the radio reports were ominous. American aircraft were arriving in greater numbers, and there were rumors that fast battleships from Admiral William Halsey's Third Fleet might be turning back toward Leyte Gulf. The Johnston's end came at 10 o'clock in the morning, nearly 3 hours after she began her charge. Dead in the water, listing 45 degrees, fires consuming her superstructure, the destroyer had become a funeral pyre for her crew. Commander Evans, weakened by blood loss and barely conscious, finally gave the order he had delayed as long as physically possible: abandon ship. Survivors leaped into water thick with oil, swimming away from the ship as Japanese destroyers closed in. The destroyer Yukikaze approached, her captain ordering ceasefire as he recognized the American ship was finished. Japanese sailors lined the rails, and in an extraordinary moment of respect, an enemy officer raised his hand in salute to the burning destroyer and the courage of her crew. Minutes later, the Johnston rolled over and sank stern first, her bow rising briefly toward the sky before sliding beneath the waves. She took 186 men with her, including Commander Ernest Evans, whose body was never recovered. Admiral Sprague, coordinating the defense from the bridge of the Fanshawe Bay, received fragmentary reports that painted a picture of devastating loss. The whole was gone. The Samuel B. Roberts was gone. The Johnston was gone. The Gambier Bay, one of his escort carriers, had taken fatal damage and was sinking. Hundreds of men were dead or dying in the water, many grievously wounded, some swimming through burning oil. Yet incredibly, impossibly, his task force had not been annihilated. The Japanese fleet, which should have massacred his ships in the first hour, was not pressing the attack with the aggression he expected. Through the smoke and confusion, he observed Japanese ships turning away, maneuvering uncertainly, breaking off pursuit. Something had changed in the enemy's calculus, some factor that his desperate defense had introduced into Admiral Kurita's decision-making process. At 10:20 in the morning, Admiral Kurita made the call that naval historians would debate for decades. He ordered his center force to break off the attack and withdraw. His reasoning, articulated in post-war interrogations preserved in the archives of the U.S. Naval War College, centered on the chaos his fleet had endured. The ferocity of the destroyer attack had convinced him he was facing a much more powerful American force than intelligence suggested. Possibly fleet carriers rather than escort carriers. Possibly a major surface action group rather than a screening force. The damage to his cruisers, while not fatal to most vessels, had disrupted his formation and reduced his combat effectiveness. The aircraft attacks, though inflicted minimal actual damage, created an environment of constant threat and forced his ships into evasive maneuvers that consumed fuel and time. Most critically, he feared that continuing the engagement would trap his fleet in Leyte Gulf, where American fast battleships could corner and destroy his force. He chose survival over glory, withdrawal over annihilation of his command, a decision that saved his ships, but surrendered Japan's last realistic chance to disrupt the American liberation of the Philippines. The Philippine Sea became a vast graveyard of bobbing heads and desperate men clinging to debris. Survivors from the Johnston, Howell, and Samuel B. Roberts treaded water in clusters, many wounded, all exhausted, watching the Japanese fleet steam away toward the horizon. Lieutenant Robert Billy, one of the Johnston's surviving officers, gathered men around floating wreckage and began taking stock. Of the 327 men who had crewed the destroyer that morning, fewer than half remained alive. Some had gone down with the ship, trapped in flooded compartments or killed at their duty stations. Others had been wounded so grievously they could not survive the swim away from the sinking vessel. Still others succumbed to injuries in the water, their lifeblood mixing with the oil and salt. Those who remained faced a new terror. Sharks, attracted by blood and thrashing, began to circle. The rescue operations began within hours but stretched across days. Destroyers and destroyer escorts that had survived the battle risked submarine attack to search for survivors. The USS Dennis pulled 141 men from the water, many requiring immediate medical attention. Landing craft from the invasion beaches, small boats never designed for open ocean rescue operations, ventured into the search area guided by spotter aircraft. Sailors aboard rescue vessels worked until their hands bled, hauling exhausted survivors aboard, performing triage on decks slippery with seawater and blood. Pharmacists' mates worked without rest, treating burns, shrapnel wounds, compound fractures, and shock. Some survivors were in the water for 50 hours before rescue, kept alive by improvised rafts and sheer determination. Others were never found, their final moments witnessed only by shipmates who lacked the strength to help. Commander Evans's body was among those never recovered. His surviving crew members, interviewed years later for oral history projects preserved at the Naval War College, spoke of their captain with a reverence typically reserved for saints. He had been demanding, expecting excellence and receiving it. He had been fearless, charging when any sane commander would have retreated. He had been selfless, remaining at his post directing fire when he could have abandoned ship with the first wave of evacuees. The Navy would posthumously award him the Medal of Honor, the citation reading in part that he had gallantly and intrepidly fought his ship against overwhelming odds, and that his superb leadership and courageous determination had inspired his crew to achieve the impossible. For Native American communities, Evans became a symbol of pride, a Cherokee warrior who brought indigenous fighting spirit to modern naval warfare. Admiral Kurita's withdrawal became one of the most controversial decisions in Japanese naval history. Within days, analysts in Tokyo and Washington were dissecting his choice, debating whether he had thrown away Japan's last opportunity for a meaningful naval victory. The raw numbers suggested he should have continued. His battleships still had full magazines, his speed advantage remained intact, and the prize, the American landing forces at Leyte Gulf, was within reach. But those raw numbers failed to capture the psychological impact of the destroyer charge. Kurita's officers had watched tin cans absorb punishment that should have vaporized them, had seen torpedoes streak through the water toward billion-yen battleships, had experienced the chaos of a battle that refused to follow the script. The Americans had introduced an element Japanese planning had not accounted for. Men willing to die to buy time, ships whose value was measured not in tonnage but in minutes purchased with blood. The Battle off Samar, as historians would name this engagement, entered the naval warfare curriculum at institutions worldwide as a case study in courage, sacrifice, and the limits of material superiority. At the U.S. Naval Academy, midshipmen studied how 7 small warships held off 23 larger vessels through aggressive tactics and acceptance of casualties. At the Japanese Naval Staff College, before its closure after the war, instructors analyzed how Admiral Kurita's overwhelming force failed to achieve its objective despite every tactical advantage. The battle demonstrated that morale, leadership, and willingness to engage in close combat could offset disparities in firepower, a lesson that would inform naval doctrine for generations. The destroyers and destroyer escorts of Taffy 3 proved that victory does not always go to the strongest, but sometimes to those most willing to fight when retreat would be safer. The casualty lists from October 25th arrived at American homes throughout November and December of 1944, each telegram representing a family shattered by loss. In Oklahoma, Ernest Evans's wife received notification that her husband was missing and presumed dead, a widow at 32 with small children who would grow up with only photographs and stories of their father. The casualty rate aboard the sunken destroyers was devastating. The Johnston lost 57% of her crew. The Hull lost 61%. The Samuel B. Roberts lost 30%. These were not abstract statistics, but sons, fathers, brothers, husbands whose bodies would never be recovered, whose graves would forever be marked as lost at sea on military records filed in the National Archives. Survivors carried wounds both visible and invisible for the remainder of their lives. Gunner's mate Paul Henry returned to civilian life with shrapnel scars across his back and nightmares that jolted him awake screaming for decades. Lieutenant Robert Hagan received medical discharge after months of treatment for burns and broken bones, his naval career ending at 24. Pharmacist's mate James O'Donnell, who had treated wounded men on the Johnston's deck while shells exploded around him, returned to practice medicine in Michigan but never spoke of the battle to his patients. The memories too raw even 30 years later. Survivors' reunions, held annually beginning in 1947, became both celebration and mourning. Men grateful to be alive yet haunted by those who were not. The weight of survival guilt evident in quiet conversations over beer and coffee. The Japanese also counted their costs, though their losses in the battle were measured more in opportunity than lives. The Kumano, her bow destroyed by the Johnston's torpedoes, limped back to Japan for repairs and was later sunk by submarine. The Suzuya, damaged in the engagement, was finished off by aircraft later that same day. The Chikuma, hit by destroyer fire and aircraft bombs, was scuttled after further damage made her unseaworthy. These were irreplaceable assets for a navy that had already suffered catastrophic losses at Midway, the Philippine Sea, and countless other engagements. More significantly, the withdrawal from Leyte Gulf marked the end of the Japanese Navy as an effective fighting force. Never again would Japan assemble a surface fleet capable of contesting American naval dominance in the Pacific. The battle off Samar was the Imperial Navy's last roll of the dice, and the tin cans had called their bluff. Admiral Clifton Sprague submitted his after-action report with words that reflected both professional assessment and deep emotion. His report, preserved in naval archives and later published in Samuel Morrison's Comprehensive History of Naval Operations, described the actions of the destroyers and destroyer escorts as exceeding any reasonable expectation of duty. He wrote that their attacks were delivered with reckless abandon, and that the men who crewed these ships had performed their duties magnificently, in the face of certain death. Sprague recommended numerous decorations, including Medal of Honor nominations for Commanders Evans, Kintberger, and Copeland. He concluded his report with an observation that echoed through naval circles. The Japanese must have been confused by the ferocity of our attack, for they expected us to run while we charged. The physical evidence of the battle rested in 13,000 feet of water until 2019, when the wreckage of the USS Johnston was located by deep-sea exploration vessel Petrel. Video footage from the remotely operated vehicle revealed the destroyer's hull resting upright on the seafloor, her gun still pointing defiantly forward. Her superstructure collapsed, but her hull number, 557, still visible through decades of marine growth and corrosion. The discovery renewed interest in the battle, bringing the sacrifice of these men back to public attention 75 years after the engagement. The wreckage site was designated a protected war grave, ensuring that the final resting place of Commander Evans and his crew would remain undisturbed. A monument in the deep to the morning tin cans refused to yield. The battle off Samar's impact rippled far beyond the immediate tactical situation in Leyte Gulf. The engagement fundamentally altered American naval doctrine regarding destroyer employment and crew training. Prior to October 25th, destroyers were primarily viewed as screening vessels, important but secondary combatants whose role was to protect more valuable capital ships. After Samar, naval planners recognized that properly commanded and aggressively handled destroyers could serve as decisive combat units capable of affecting battle outcomes against superior forces. Training curricula at destroyer schools emphasized close-range engagement tactics, torpedo attack doctrine, and the psychological impact of aggressive action. Future destroyer commanders studied the decisions made by Evans, Kintberger, and Copeland, learning that audacity could compensate for material disadvantage. Admiral Halsey's decision to pursue the Japanese carrier force north instead of remaining to guard the San Bernardino Strait became one of the most debated choices of the Pacific War. Historians, including prominent naval scholar James Hornfisher, whose research into the battle produced the definitive account, The Last Stand of the Tin Can Sailors, argued that Halsey's absence created the crisis that Taffy 3 faced. Had Halsey's fast battleships been positioned to intercept Admiral Kurita, the battle off Samar would never have occurred. Conversely, defenders of Halsey's decision pointed out that his pursuit eliminated Japan's remaining carrier capability, ensuring no future large-scale naval aviation threats. The debate highlighted the complexity of command decisions in fluid combat situations where perfect information is impossible, and commanders must balance competing priorities. The strategic consequence of the battle was the secure establishment of American forces in the Philippines. The landing forces at Leyte, protected by Taffy 3's sacrifice, successfully established beachheads that would never be dislodged. Douglas MacArthur's return to the Philippines, his promise to the Filipino people fulfilled, proceeded without the catastrophic disruption that would have occurred had Kurita's battleships reached the landing beaches. The liberation campaign continued through 1945, eventually freeing Manila and neutralizing Japanese forces throughout the archipelago. The Philippine campaign severed Japan's supply lines to resource-rich territories in Southeast Asia, particularly the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies. Without those resources, Japan's ability to fuel its military machine collapsed, accelerating the empire's inevitable defeat. Post-war analysis by both American and Japanese military scholars identified several factors that contributed to Kurita's decision to withdraw. The destroyer attacks, while the most visible factor, occurred within a broader context of communications failures, intelligence gaps, and psychological pressure. Kurita had not received clear information about Admiral Halsey's position and worried about being caught between American forces. His ships had been under constant air attack for days, depleting anti-aircraft ammunition and exhausting crews. The loss of the super battleship Musashi the previous day had demonstrated that even the mightiest warships were vulnerable. The confusion of battle, compounded by smoke and poor visibility, made accurate assessment of enemy forces nearly impossible. Within this context, the ferocity of the destroyer charge became the deciding factor, not because it inflicted fatal damage, but because it reinforced Kurita's worst fears about the size and capability of the force opposing him. The decorations awarded to Taffy 3's sailors reflected the Navy's recognition of extraordinary valor. Commander Ernest Evans received the Medal of Honor posthumously, the citation noting his conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life. Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland received the Navy Cross for his handling of the Samuel B. Roberts. Commander Leon Kintberger received the Navy Cross posthumously. Dozens of Silver Stars, Bronze Stars, and Navy and Marine Corps medals were distributed to survivors and posthumously to the fallen. Yet some veterans of the battle later commented that the true recognition came not from medals, but from the knowledge that their sacrifice had mattered, that the minutes they bought with their lives had saved thousands of soldiers and sailors who might otherwise have perished. In the calculus of war, 3 destroyers and 1 destroyer escort purchased the successful liberation of the Philippines, a trade no commander would willingly make but one that history judged as decisive. The story of the Battle off Samar entered American popular consciousness gradually, emerging from classified reports into public awareness as the war ended and sailors returned home with tales that seemed too incredible to believe. Newspaper accounts in 1945 described the engagement in dramatic terms, though censorship prevented identification of specific ships or commanders until after Japan's surrender. The Saturday Evening Post published a detailed account in 1946, interviewing survivors and piecing together the chronology of the battle. Readers responded with astonishment. How had they not heard of this engagement during the war? Why had the heroism of these sailors remained hidden? The answer lay partially in military censorship, but also in the overwhelming flood of war news that made even extraordinary actions seem routine in the final year of the Pacific conflict. Hollywood took notice, though the complete story never received the blockbuster treatment accorded to other naval engagements like Midway or the Bismarck Chase. The battle appeared in documentary films, most notably in the 1952 production, The Battle for Leyte Gulf, which included interviews with survivors and dramatic reenactments of the destroyer charges. Television documentaries in subsequent decades featured the engagement, particularly as the 50th anniversary approached in 1994. The History Channel produced an extended special examining the battle from both American and Japanese perspectives, including interviews with elderly Japanese veterans who still expressed amazement at the Americans' willingness to charge into certain death. These productions ensured that new generations learned of Taffy 3's stand, preventing the battle from fading into the obscurity that claimed many wartime engagements. The publication of James Hornfischer's The Last Stand of the Tin Can Sailors in 2004 marked a renaissance in public awareness of the battle. Hornfischer's meticulous research, drawing on declassified documents, personal interviews, and Japanese sources, created a narrative that captured both the tactical details and human drama of the engagement. The book became a bestseller, winning the Samuel Eliot Morrison Award for Naval Literature and introducing the Battle off Samar to readers who had never heard the story. Reviews in major publications like the New York Times and the Washington Post praised Hornfischer's work for rescuing from obscurity one of the most remarkable naval engagements in American history. The book's success prompted renewed interest in destroyer warfare and led to increased recognition for the surviving veterans. Memorials to the battle and its fallen emerged across America, from small-town plaques to major naval installations. The Destroyer Escort Sailors Monument at the Washington Navy Yard includes prominent recognition of the Samuel B. Roberts and her crew. In Pawnee, Oklahoma, Ernest Evans's hometown, a memorial park bears his name, with a bronze plaque describing his Medal of Honor citation. The USS Johnston's bell, recovered from the wreckage in 2019, is displayed at the National Museum of the U.S. Navy, where visitors can stand before the tarnished brass artifact and contemplate the men who answered its call to battle stations on October 25, 1944. Annual memorial services attended by dwindling numbers of survivors and growing numbers of descendants ensure that the sacrifice of these sailors remains in living memory. The comparison to other famous last stands, the Spartans at Thermopylae, the Texans at the Alamo, the British at Rorke's Drift, became inevitable as the battle's legend grew. Military historians noted parallels. In each case, a small force held off a much larger enemy through courage and tactical skill, buying time for strategic objectives to be achieved. The Battle off Samar shared with these legendary engagements the element of seemingly hopeless odds overcome through sheer determination. Yet Taffy 3's stand also differed from these historical precedents. The American sailors survived in greater numbers, their victory was more complete in its strategic effects, and their story remained obscure for decades rather than being immediately celebrated. The delayed recognition perhaps made the eventual acknowledgement more powerful, a reminder that heroism does not always receive instant acclaim, but that history ultimately honors those who stood when running would have been easier. The final survivors of the Battle off Samar carried their memories into the 21st century, their numbers dwindling with each passing year until only a handful remained. Bill Mercer, who served aboard the Johnston as a torpedo striker, attended reunions well into his 90s, shaking hands with younger sailors and Marines who thanked him for his service with genuine reverence. When asked about the charge against the Japanese fleet, Mercer would shake his head with a slight smile and say simply, "We did what Commander Evans told us to do." This humility, shared by virtually all survivors, masked the extraordinary nature of their actions. These were not men seeking glory, but sailors who performed their duty under circumstances that would break lesser individuals. Their stories, preserved in oral history archives at the Naval War College and the Library of Congress, provide unfiltered accounts of the terror, chaos, and determination that defined October 25, 1944. Modern naval warfare has evolved far beyond the gun and torpedo engagements of World War II, with missiles that can strike from beyond the horizon and sensors that can track targets hundreds of miles away. Yet the core lessons of the Battle off Samar remain relevant to contemporary naval officers studying at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. The battle demonstrates that technology and firepower, while important, do not guarantee victory if leadership and morale are lacking. It proves that aggressive action can disrupt enemy plans and create psychological effects beyond physical damage inflicted. Most importantly, it validates the principle that well-trained crews led by competent commanders can achieve results that exceed rational expectations. These lessons appear in contemporary doctrine for asymmetric naval warfare, where smaller forces must develop tactics to counter more powerful opponents. The cultural impact of the Battle off Samar extended beyond military circles into broader American consciousness about courage and sacrifice. The image of tin can destroyers charging battleships became a metaphor for confronting overwhelming odds with determination rather than despair. Business schools cited the battle as a case study in leadership under pressure and making bold decisions with incomplete information. The engagement appeared in motivational speeches, in discussions of organizational culture, in examinations of what inspires people to perform beyond expected limits. Commander Evans's speech to his crew, acknowledging that survival could not be expected while simultaneously preparing to fight, became a template for honest leadership that does not sugarcoat reality, yet inspires commitment to a cause larger than self-preservation. The discovery of the USS Johnston's wreckage in 2019 by the research vessel Petrel, funded by the late Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen, provided closure for families who had waited 75 years to know the ship's final resting place. The remotely operated vehicle descended more than 20,000 feet, deeper than the Titanic, to document the destroyer's remains. Video footage showed damage consistent with the battle reports: shell holes in the hull, collapsed superstructure, the bridge where Commander Evans made his final stand now crushed by water pressure and time. Marine biologists noted that the wreck had become an artificial reef, supporting diverse sea life in the abyssal depths, a living memorial where the dead sailors rested. The Philippine government declared the wreck site a protected zone, ensuring no salvage operations would disturb what had become hallowed ground beneath the waves. Contemporary commemorations of the battle take multiple forms, from academic conferences examining tactical details to ceremonies honoring the fallen. The Navy's Arleigh Burke-class destroyer USS The Sullivans, named for 5 brothers who died together at Guadalcanal, includes displays about the battle off Samar in her history spaces, connecting different stories of naval sacrifice across the Pacific War. The annual Navy Birthday Ball, celebrated each October 13th, frequently includes presentations about Taffy 3's stand, reminding current sailors of their service's heritage of courage under fire. Veterans organizations, particularly the Tin Can Sailors Association, maintain websites and archives preserving documents, photographs, and personal accounts from survivors, ensuring that researchers and interested citizens can access primary source material about the engagement. The Japanese perspective on the battle evolved considerably in post-war decades. Initial accounts, written in the immediate aftermath of defeat, portrayed Admiral Kurita's withdrawal as a tactical error that cost Japan its last opportunity for naval victory. Later assessments, particularly after American accounts became available, acknowledged the effectiveness of the destroyer attacks in creating confusion and inflicting damage. Contemporary Japanese naval historians, writing in journals like Ships of the World, recognized that Kurita faced genuine tactical dilemmas with imperfect information under combat stress. Some Japanese veterans who survived the battle expressed respect for their American opponents, noting that the destroyers fought with a Bushido-like spirit that honored both navies. This mutual respect between former enemies, developed decades after the guns fell silent, represented a form of healing that war itself makes impossible. The broader question of whether the sacrifice was necessary haunts some historical analysis. If Admiral Halsey had not pursued the Japanese carrier force north, if reconnaissance had detected Kurita's approach earlier, if the San Bernardino Strait had been properly guarded, then Taffy 3 would never have found itself in desperate circumstances requiring desperate measures. Survivors sometimes pondered this in later years. Had their shipmates died because of avoidable command failures? The consensus among military historians holds that, while the strategic situation could have been managed differently once the crisis occurred, the actions taken by Taffy 3's commanders were not only appropriate, but exemplary. The alternative, attempting to flee without fighting, would likely have resulted in the same losses without achieving the strategic objective of protecting the landing forces. Educational institutions incorporated the Battle off Samar into curricula beyond military academies. High schools teaching World War II history used the battle as an example of American determination and sacrifice. College courses on military history examined the engagement from multiple angles: tactical decisions, strategic implications, leadership under pressure, and the human cost of war. Philosophy courses discussed the ethical dimensions of ordering men into situations where survival cannot be expected, examining whether Commander Evans's decision represented moral leadership or reckless endangerment. These academic discussions kept the battle relevant to new generations, ensuring that the story remained more than historical footnote instead, serving as a continuing source of insight into human behavior under extreme stress. The final assessment of the Battle off Samar must balance tactical analysis with human recognition. From a purely military standpoint, 7 small warships delayed a powerful fleet for hours, prevented catastrophic damage to landing forces, and contributed to the strategic success of the Philippine campaign. 3 destroyers and 1 destroyer escort were lost, along with nearly 700 men killed or missing, in exchange for damaging several Japanese cruisers and forcing the withdrawal of an intact battleship force. The exchange rate seems unfavorable until one considers what would have occurred without that sacrifice. The slaughter of thousands of soldiers and sailors at the landing beaches, the potential failure of MacArthur's return to the Philippines, the extension of the Pacific War by months or years. In this context, the sacrifice of Taffy 3 purchased outcomes far exceeding the immediate tactical results. Yet numbers and strategic assessments fail to capture the essential truth of October 25, 1944. On that morning, men who had every rational reason to flee instead charged toward their deaths because their commanders asked them to, because their shipmates stood beside them, because surrender or retreat violated something fundamental in their understanding of duty and honor. They were not seeking death, but accepting its probability as the cost of doing what needed to be done. This willingness to face annihilation for a cause larger than self-preservation represents humanity at its most noble and most terrible. Noble because it demonstrates courage beyond survival instinct. Terrible because war demands such sacrifices in the first place. The tin cans that the Japanese laughed at proved that ships are only as strong as the men who crew them, that courage can offset firepower, and that sometimes the smallest vessels cast the longest shadows. The sun that rose blood red over the Philippine Sea on October 25, 1944, set that evening on a transformed strategic situation and a battle that would echo through naval history for generations. The Japanese fleet that had approached with such confidence limped away, never again to threaten American operations in force. The escort carriers that should have been slaughtered continued launching aircraft, supporting the liberation of the Philippines and the eventual defeat of Imperial Japan. And on the seafloor, in darkness that no sunlight would ever penetrate, 3 destroyers and 1 destroyer escort rested with their dead, eternal sentinels, marking the place where tin cans became legends and ordinary men achieved immortality through extraordinary courage. Their story, once nearly forgotten, now stands as testament to a simple truth: that valor, sacrifice, and determination can overcome any odds when men refuse to yield, refuse to retreat, and refuse to accept that their cause is lost simply because the enemy is stronger. The Japanese had laughed at the tin can destroyers, until one bold charge sent their fleet running and changed the course of history.